Next speaker is Eric Gordon. Eric is working in Boston at Emerson College, where he is splitting his activities in actually two different departments. One of them is the Engagement Game Lab. The other one is the Department of Visual and Media Arts. And he's also, as a third affiliation, he's at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Eric has a BA in sociology from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he then moved to Los Angeles for an MA and a PhD in the Department of Critical Studies at the University of Southern California. Now, today he is talking about a topic that he has published a lot on and has talked a lot about, and I think this is a fantastic title, Meaningful Inefficiencies. Welcome with me, Eric Gordon.
Thank you. All right, this is on. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the generous invitation. It's I've never been to Zurich before, so I've been enjoying wandering around in my sleepless stupor, and happy to have had some sleep last night. So I'm going to talk about this idea of meaningful inefficiencies. As was just mentioned, it's a concept that I've been working on for some time, and about which I'm writing a book on at the moment. But let me tell you a little bit in way of background. So I'm at a lab called the Engagement Lab. We're an applied research lab focused on understanding and inventing new methods of public participation in a digital age. So very much resonates with the conversation we've been having this morning. Our work is really looking at the ways in which people are participating in the kinds of interfaces that we are building between citizens and institutions. And we're also committed to a form of participatory research and human-centered design. So a lot of the work we do is methodological as well within the context of the Engagement Lab. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the project work that we're doing, as well as some of the research. But by way of an introduction to what I want to talk about today, and I agree with other things that have been said, that it's not necessary to introduce. Oh, thank you. The echo just went away. That's fantastic. It's not necessary to rehash some of the critiques necessarily of the smart city. Increasingly, as I go to events and participate in conversations, there is an understanding that there are some issues with the market-driven term smart cities. And and there's a lot of really interesting discussion about the concept of what it means to be smart and who is smart. What I want to talk about this morning is really putting this contemporary conversation around smart cities, which is really technology in the public realm, how we want to talk about technology in the public realm in relation to other modes of city building that have happened in the past. So let me just start by just very quickly reviewing previous models of city building. And I'm going to use a lot of examples from the United States, and so I apologize for that, but hopefully we will have some points of discussion about some of the comparisons between European cities. So in the United States, the concept of urban renewal was one way of thinking about infrastructure. And here I show you images of Boston's West End as it was being destroyed, in Boston's new West End now, which was sort of the core of the city of Boston, which is one of the victims per se of urban renewal in the middle of the century, where the concept was really a kind of notion of the body that was actually interestingly told by a developer named Homer Hoyt and he was in reference to American cities. He says, like a cancer, blight spreads through all the tissues of the urban body, and the urban organism is unable to cure itself except by a major surgical operation. And this was a way of justifying the idea of sort of tearing out parts of cities that were experiencing disuse or decline. And what that often meant was they were experiencing a white flight, and a diminishing tax base that was being essentially occupied only by people with brown skin. And so there was a challenge in the middle of the century in the United States of again sort of removing the cancer of blight without much consideration as to what that meant. This is another example. From Los Angeles. This is the Bunker Hill neighborhood of Los Angeles that was sort of pulled out and replaced with the skyscraper downtown core that LA has right now. What's interesting about these models of city building is that the perspective of the human was not really taken into consideration outside of the mobility that human needed, or at least it was perceived to have needed. So the idea of highways replacing urban cores, the pedestrian became increasingly less important, and the transportation in from the outside was the way in which cities were being conceived of and built. And largely what's interesting is that there was a concept of the city as it was seen from below, but largely as it was seen from moving vehicles. Again, the city was something, as the cancer was being removed, the city was something, again, to be traveled into, not necessarily to be lived in, because there was an assumption of the kinds of people who were occupying those cities, largely white and middle class. So there is, changes in other ways of thinking about the city also had a kind of disembodiment. So we think about this sort of city from above, of course made famous by Brasilia, as it represents the jet age quite literally, but only as you see it from an airplane, or even in sort of famous projects. This has preceded the urban renewal movement, but famous projects like Rockefeller Center that had an appeal had an appeal from above, this kind of impossible perspective that didn't necessarily include the located human. So this move towards locating the user, or kind of thinking about the embodiment of people who occupy the city, is one of the things that I think is distinct about our current emphasis on city building. That often when we think about cities now, and even when we think about smart cities now, that there is a sense that the human matters in some way. The human is the controller of the technology, the producer of the data. And in that sense, that human has a kind of rediscovered position. So and I think about this in terms of the rise of civic tech or civic technology, something like 311, which is I don't know. I don't know that it's called 311 in most European cities, but there are similar systems that we see all over the world, which are essentially complaint management systems, right? So there's a street light out. Or there's graffiti on the corner, or there's a pothole. These are systems that are organized either by telephone or increasingly by mobile apps, where people can essentially contribute that data. So this has become one of the most talked about mechanisms. And the sort of success case that people talk about when they think about civic tech and its contribution to the smart city is something like 311, which locates the citizen as a producer of data and kind of crowdsources. Let's pause for the bells, shall we? Sort of crowdsources data and problems for city government. So what's interesting about this is that I gave you this super quick, overview of urban renewal as a concept. The real concept that I wanted to get across was that the location of the human user was impossible or disembodied. The location of the human user now is much more possible, located within the data he or she produces. So the idea of the smart city and the idea of the smart user experience has been illustrated in a number of different ways. This one I took from the Smart City Consortium in Hong Kong, where this is what is said about it. The goal of a smart city is to enhance the quality of life enjoyed by all residents through using ICT to improve the efficiency of social services. So again, a very located kind of human perspective of what it means to be in a smart city, which is to be in a machine that is satisfactorily efficient, that provides services in a way that is responsive to the perceived needs of the human user, as those needs are communicated through the data that user produces and that the city then collects and aggregates. So this is a model of the smart city that has been used to some success. As we think about what a smart and responsive city means, essentially now we're thinking about this machine not as a body that has where the civic organization has the ability to remove cancer, but instead as a machine that we have the ability to tweak and to hack. And so this is from the San Francisco's mayor's office, something they published in 2013, which I think is worth sharing. They say cities are like living machines, and policymaking and government is like writing the code that governs how a city operates. This city is the most complex machine I have ever had the opportunity to hack, and it is what inspired my shift from the private sector to the public sector, #Hello World. So here is a civil servant who is coming into government and understanding, taking that kind of Silicon Valley perspective of machines that can be hacked and applying it to what it means to be in a city. So again, the data, the human is there. The human is there as the producer of data, but then the government is there as a technologist, essentially, to make efficient, to create efficient systems. So speaking of Hello World, this is an example from what has a large-scale intervention into what we might think of as smart cities. This is Link NYC in New York City, which is currently there's over 900 of these kiosks that are spread throughout the city that are collecting information such as IP addresses, anonymized MAC addresses, device type, device identifiers, keeping that information for up to 60 days, and then there's cameras on each of these things and keeping that data up to 7 days. So the point being that this is the way in which the city becomes responsive. The city becomes responsive by planting sensors throughout that city and collecting data from its human users that we are now experiencing the rhetoric of the importance of that human. But in order for that human to be important in the machine that we are talking about, that human needs to leave traces. That human needs to leave data. Otherwise, it doesn't operate within the machine. And of course, this is this quote from Keith Alexander: "You need the haystack to find the needle." What's fascinating about this data collection is that in most cases, this data is being collected without really understanding why. There's no IRB here. We're collecting this data, and then we're going to figure out what to do with it later. And that's that can be troubling. But I think that's the context that we're working in at the moment. And when I think about smart cities and what we mean by city building, what we're doing is we're constructing our data infrastructure so that we can build the city, so that we can locate the human and create usable social services and interfaces for that human, but at what costs? And so here I lead to us to think about design values in chapter 2, and this is really the core of what I want to talk about today. As we think about what it means to operate within this new city context, what are the values that are being brought to that context? And let me step back just for a moment again and talk about distrust in institutions. So we're talking a lot about cities, but cities are in addition to space, they are also a conglomeration of institutions. And this is data from the US, only goes up into 2015, but those numbers are still going down. This is a Pew study done that was a survey study done on the trust in the US government. And what is not surprising is that trust is going down at a rapid clip. And what is also perhaps not surprising is that this data is not only isolated to government. Trust in institutions in general is down globally. So in addition to trust in government, trust in media institutions, even trust in civil society institutions, NGOs, even churches, the trust in institutions generally is down. And that means, and so we can interpret that in a lot of ways, but one way of thinking about that is that digital technology has created an opportunity for us to imagine what it looks like to operate in a society unmediated by institutions, right? We can do a lot outside of the mediating function of institutions. So 311 that I showed you before is an example of we don't need to rely on government to identify problems, we could do it. And so much of the discourse of a lot of civic tech projects is about sort of citizen empowerment in a way that bypasses institutions. Now, I don't want to suggest that that's a simple explanation for distrust in institutions. I think it's much more complex than that. I just want to bring that up as one of the factors that we are operating in, that essentially we are operating in a media and technology ecosystem that enables us to imagine the world outside of institutions, and so the way in which we think about institutions is now riddled with distrust. Now, also coming from the United States, the elephant in the room is perhaps our president, who is contributing to that distrust in institutions largely, and that's not just located in the United States, but I think on a government level there is a sort of fomenting of trust, or sort of fomenting of discontent around both the actions of government and the actions of media. And so again, like the example of Donald Trump taking directly to Twitter is one example of the way in which we can imagine bypassing institutions in the way that we lead our lives. So I want to start with one example from the city of Boston. This is an example that involved the public school system in the city of Boston, where the problem was fairly simple in that the city wanted to change the start times of all of the schools in Boston, starting with the high schools. So at the high school level, the city's public schools started very, very early, about 7:15 in the morning. And so there was a sense that, and there's lots of research to back this up, that teenagers don't do well in the morning. And so there was a desire to push those start times back to at least after 8 a.m. And so in order to do that in the city of Boston, it was actually a complex engineering problem. So in order to move some of the high school start times back, they actually needed to coordinate with the city bus system. There are hundreds of city buses that are picking up kids throughout the city. So they needed to figure out how the city bus system was going to operate in conjunction with these new start times. And so it wasn't as simple as just moving the high school start times. They actually needed to move all of the city's 300 schools to a different start time. So even at the elementary level, those schools all shifted times, sometimes by upwards of 2 hours. So some of the schools that started at 9 a.m. were now starting at 7 a.m. and vice versa. So what happened, the process where this happened was some crackerjack engineers at MIT, these PhD students, designed this thing called the quantum routing interface, which was essentially a tool that was a super smart algorithm that was able to determine the new start times for all the schools across the city. And this amazing algorithm was then announced to the city, and it was met with things like this. So massive protests at the headquarters of the Boston Public Schools, and what ended up happening was the superintendent of schools stepped back his decision and said, okay, we're going to consider this for another year. we're not going to do this. Not only did the city fail to consult families, but the city also failed to consult bus drivers and all the other stakeholders that were going to be impacted by this decision. So here we have an incredibly smart top-down algorithm that was met with resistance because there was not one attempt to consult with families over these decisions. So I use this example to really to address and I think reinforce what we've already been talking about this morning, which is the need for public consultation, even when we have the smartest decision that we can make. And so one of the ways of thinking about this is making the invisible visible. One of the problems with this black box algorithm was that it was a black box algorithm. So no one understood what was happening, how these decisions were being made, what data was being collected. And it's just not to suggest that people needed to understand the data science behind it, but people needed to understand the nature of the data that was being collected and why these decisions were being made. And so as Martin Buber says, the ordered world is not the world order, and it may be something for us to consider to shift from when we think about smart cities to sort of make that move from just thinking about technology infrastructure to thinking about interface, where again this process of ordering is laid bare, where we actually can sort of build out processes to create to make visible the invisible. And so I use this now famous quote from David Foster Wallace in his speech at Kenyon College. He says, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And and I fear that we can replace that with data now. You know, that this is what the hell is data, and ultimately this is the need to sort of again make visible the things that are invisible is of a highest priority, and you know, and we can think about this in this idea of the habitus. The notion of being in the world and the normative assumptions that we have in being in the world, and what Pierre Bourdieu says about developing a feel for the game. And he says that ultimately we're in these systems and we develop a feel for the game. We understand it, that we don't have to think about the rules all the time because we understand the habitus that we exist in. And then he talks about this idea of fields, of social constructs that are entered in, and he has this lovely quote where he says that he talks about the social life as that almost miraculous encounter between habitus and field, between the things that are normalized and the things that are constraints that are put on top of those everyday social systems, and it's when we notice that miraculous encounter where the possibilities become present. And so I'm going to put this in the context of some other research that I've done. I just want to check on time. Some other research that I've done that have looked at the way that practitioners that I identify as civic organizations, and I can explain this a little bit, but the way that people working in civic organizations understand how they're using media in this context of distrust that I've talked about before. And so as part of the study that we just completed, and it's actually in this report here, and I have a couple if anybody's interested, but we interviewed 40 civic organizations, people from civic organizations. We asked them about the way in which they're using media to engage publics. And this is a concept that we call civic media, that is a way of thinking about it's a way of thinking about media and technology that facilitates democratic process. And so really what we're interested in this civic media is the sort of application of media and technology for the purpose of democratic process. And so let me explain what came out of this study that we conducted. So we understand civic media practice as being organized around these two axes, essentially. Social infrastructure is the horizontal, and objective is the vertical. So let me try to explain that how this works. Is that as people, the people that we spoke to within these organizations, including journalistic organizations and quasi-public organizations, the way that people are talking about their use of media was that they were moving towards that top right-hand quadrant. They were trying to build strong social infrastructure through their media use, and they were trying to work towards longitudinal objectives. And they did it through 4 primary activities that I'm going to explain to you right now. Network building, holding space for discussion, distributing ownership, and persistent input. Now, the reason that these are such remarkable and at the same time unremarkable activities is that these are the things that happen all the time as people use technology that nobody pays attention to. And what was interesting in the people that we spoke to was that as they described the work that they did, they weren't necessarily talking about better decisions being made that had less with less resistance from the public. They weren't necessarily talking about bigger audience bases. They were talking about these things. They were talking about the use of technology to build trust among their constituents. And so let me describe network building as one of the major activities. So this is simply the act of convening either in person or online for the purpose of social connectivity. One of the things that happens all the time in the use of technology that we don't often talk about is this. People convene. And that is an activity that we fail often to document. In that, and again, I think the example from your example this morning, I think that one of the things that you did was convene people. You talked about this inefficient process, and you were able to convene people over time and build those networks. Now, whether or not there were better decisions made, we can table that, and we can say that the value here is the act of convening because those networks were being created. Now, the other thing that's part of this that people were doing and they spoke very passionately about was this holding space for discussion idea, which is simply assuring that there is time and space for discussion that makes room for multiple viewpoints and is tolerant of dissent. This is different than simply convening. This is the actual work of taking the time to make sure that the right people are in the room, that the representative people are in the room, that you have in that discussion all the voices that need to be heard. And as we talk to people, one of the things that they said was, it's one thing to hold a meeting or to create a website or to create an app. It's quite another thing to make sure that the people that you want to use it are using it, and then to make sure that the buy-in is actually representative of a population. And so just a consideration of the time that takes was something that people felt they needed to document and to share. Finally, distributing ownership is the third activity that we point to. In this case, the designer or convener takes time to build capacity of all stakeholders to reproduce or modify designed activities. One of the challenges in the use of technology and or media in service to democratic process is that so often it's the case that the novelty that we create gets used once, and the people that are users of that novelty never can use it again, don't have the capacity to use it again, or don't even have a capacity to take what they've learned from that process and move it into another process. And so the thing that's so important about how we're using this technology is the time that it takes to distribute that ownership, which basically is another way of saying building capacity of the people that are participating and what that looks like. And so this example of this gray area was one of the organizations that we spoke to based in Oakland, California. And Gray Area is an art and is a sort of public art and design organization. And what they talked about was all the work that they did in focusing on media literacy, essentially, that it was impossible to engage the public in using media and technology without building the capacity of that public to be able to understand and use that stuff themselves. Finally, persistent input, and this is one of the more challenging activities that people spoke about, and this is inputs into products or process from stakeholders continue beyond initial release or implementation. One of the challenges of this, even though it was a value that people spoke about very commonly, one of the challenges with persistent input is that it often runs counter to project timelines and funding timelines. And so projects can run their course and be over, and then people are kind of left in the lurch. And so this is a quote from one of the people we talked to at the Invisible Institute, which is a data and journalism organization in Chicago, who said this about his work. He says, "I'm not a policy guy. I don't know what to do with public housing, but I'm standing here. And I was standing here yesterday, and I'll be standing here tomorrow, and I know this about these conditions." So it was kind of recruiting reality to our ends. What was remarkable about what he said was how when he talked about the work that he did, a big part of the work that he did was simply being there over time. And then as universities, people, specifically people from universities, and I have been guilty of this, work with communities and community organizations. We often work on semester timelines and certainly on funding cycles. And then we're kind of notorious for doing the thing and then getting the hell out and publishing our papers. And so being able to sort of bypass that model as we do this work within communities was really important. So one of the things that we try to do in this report and that I'm continuing to do now is building the capacity to articulate the value of this. So when we talk about smart cities, when we talk about the use of civic technology, we need to be able to articulate and measure the value of these kinds of activities that people are actually doing. And the way in which they talk about the importance of their work is not simply about creating more efficient systems, but doing that work of building capacity and working with organizations. And so now I get to the title of my talk, which has taken me a long time to get here. But so the way that I understand this is within this concept of meaningful inefficiencies. And let me just explain what this means. Now, this comes from an article I wrote a few years ago. Any process wherein efficiency is deprioritized in favor of relation, connection, or reflective practice. Now, that might sound mundane or even destructive, but the important thing about this is if we look back to the example of the Boston Public Schools, it would have made quite a contribution if inefficiencies were designed into that system. Right? It would have made, and one maybe could argue that it would have made it more efficient, but I don't want to argue that because I want to argue that the process, that process of governance needed to build room for itself to create the opportunity for meaning making, and it didn't do it. And that the work that's happening with practitioners in the public realm is that they are trying to build that room for themselves and lack sometimes the language to do it. Now, I'm inspired by game design. In the concept of meaningful inefficiency actually comes from that. And this is taken. So Bernard Suits is a philosopher who wrote one of my favorite books ever written called The Grasshopper, all about games. And one of the things he says in that book is that games are, by definition, inefficient systems. And he uses the example of golf to make that point. And he says that in the game of golf, the most efficient way of getting the little ball into that little hole would be to pick it up and walk over to the little hole and drop it in. But we don't do that. We stand really far away, and we have a very long stick, and then we put trees and water and sand in our way, to get us to that hole. Those are inefficiencies. And so we create what Bernard Suits calls, those are unnecessary obstacles that we put in our way to achieve our goal. But the reason we do it in the context of a game is to make meaning, is so that we can play, right? The goal of any game is to play that game. So now in the case of, I'm not suggesting that civic life is a game. What I'm suggesting is that what we can learn from game systems that are designed for players to make meaning as they work towards their goals, what we can learn from game systems is that game systems are designed with inefficiencies so that we can play and make meaning. And so I would look at, this is a move away from a kind of efficiency model, which is instrumental, transactional, and single purpose, where we move from point A to point D, to a meaningfully inefficient model where we can sort of embrace that messiness, that chaos, or that unpredictability, not as the overarching value of the system, but within the system, designing room for play within the systems that we operate in. And this is distinct from mere inefficiencies. Now, and that's really important to point out. Mere inefficiencies are those inefficiencies within systems where we have to wait in 5 really long lines in order to do anything at a government agency. That is a mere inefficiency. It causes anxiety, and it disrupts us from any opportunities for meaning making. So I just want to be clear that the value proposition that I'm proposing here is not inefficiency for the sake of inefficiency, but inefficiency as a design prompt that allows us to design systems that have clear goals that then expand so that there is room for dialogue, emergence, and even play. So let me talk about a few examples before I stop talking. So this is really in the last bit that I want to talk about is this idea of what might a community-led smart city actually look like. And one of the most famous examples in this space is the Bristol approach out of Bristol, England. They've done some extraordinary work in developing a citizen engagement process around the use of technology. And they call it the Bristol approach, which involves all sorts of meetings, feedback loops, opportunities for input into design experiments. And one of the more famous experiments was called Damp Busters, which was a sort of mold mitigation process that they did in the city. And so this is the case study that, if you haven't seen much about this is the case study that's at least in the literature that I've been reading, is the most talked about. And they talk about the concept of the commons in this case, as the project was written about, encompasses the resources we create, the way we share the resources, and the collective agreement about how we will use the resources for the common good. Huge problem there by even just talking about the common good, but let me table that for a second. The idea here is that what Bristol has done is at least created a platform to engage publics in conversations around technological solutions, and I want to leave it at that. One of the things that so we recently held a workshop at Harvard called Right to the Smart City, where we focus on designing for public value and civic participation. And in this case, we brought stakeholders together from North America and in Europe to have this conversation about what a public process might look like. What are the ways that we can engage a diversity of publics in conversations about data, about sensors, and about technology in the public realm. And out of that came a lot of really deep conversation and some concrete steps forward. One of them is a proposal now so I'm going to talk about now a proposed project in the city of Boston and just explain to you how this might work. This project is called Beta Blocks, and the proposal is to create a platform that would be composed of 6 different elements, essentially. The first element being data literacy, as I said before, the need to build capacity for deliberation is essential. And that data literacy is going to be an important part of any citizen-led smart city. Community mission statements, which I'll explain. Community mission statements are ways in which local communities can generate a problem statement and a value statement that can be used to guide technological experimentation. Connectivity, which is ways in which private vendors can be connected with both the city and local communities. Experimentation, which is an opportunity for controlled experimentation within local areas. Finally, research, by inviting in the research community. There's 1 or 2 universities in Boston. And then knowledge share, which is to create a platform that enables the kind of sharing of what happens on a local level, both throughout the city, but then also beyond. So what we have, the way that we've defined this idea of a beta block is that this should be the platform through which all smart city conversations should happen in the city. And I should also say that the city of Boston actually released an RFP. Request for proposals to conduct this project. So the city of Boston is already thinking in this way. So let me just say a little bit, data literacy and community mission statement. So the concept is that there are workshops, including conceptual frameworks, building of empathy that happens that happens on a local level, data literacy, and civic imagination. So giving people the tools that they need to not only understand the data, but also think about possible futures, using that data and understanding the technology. So this is really that first step of data literacy, what that looks like. Community mission statement would be working with an advisory group and local organization to define a mission statement on the local level that would say, here are the problems that we're experiencing. Here's what, say, for instance, in the neighborhood of Chinatown in Boston, here are the issues that we are concerned with. We're concerned with gentrification, displacement. We're concerned with crime. We're concerned with parking, as every neighborhood is. But we're concerned with all those things. So, City of Boston, when you come to us with your technology vendors, so when Verizon and AT&T and Comcast come knocking on the door and saying, we have a technology solution, first, you need to go to the community mission statement and understand whether that technology solution addresses the community mission statement. And if it doesn't, then you have to go back to the drawing board. So the idea of a community mission statement is a way of aligning both problem statements and values with technology solutions. Because at the moment, technology solutions are driving the growth of smart cities, and it should be the other way around. Connectivity and experimentation, again, guided by mission statements. This is a facilitated partnership between local communities and technology vendors. So this is a way of thinking about collaboration that can happen with continual local input, and it's also a way of, as it says here, an emerging technologically driven concept that is an active early stage development and for which a relevant community issue will become a test tube for research or process development with a clear user group and local pain point. And so the idea is that we have technology providers that are both coming at it from the we've got a technology in search of a problem, or we have a problem and we're in search of local collaboration. So we want to be able to facilitate that. And then finally, in collaboration with the city and community partners, the idea of small-scale experiments. So how can we actually bypass some of the barriers in urban experimentation on a local level, so that we can create opportunities for data sharing. So that's one of the things that would be worked out as part of the beta blocks process. And then finally, simply just being able to share that would be a phenomenal innovation within city processes. Ultimately, taking something that happens on a local level and sharing it on a city-wide level. And Boston isn't a large city, but you'd be surprised by how disconnected some of the neighborhoods in a 700,000 person city are. And so here is where I'll end with just a few notes of conclusion. So we need to recognize smart cities as another chapter in urban renewal. And this is something that I think is really important to consider, that in the middle of the century in the United States, we have a sort of dark history of urban erasure. And what we're doing now, I'm not suggesting is that, but I am suggesting that this is another infrastructure project that we're engaged in right now, and we need to consider the importance of citizen participation just as much as we reflected on the horrors of urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s and said, hey, we need to actually engage citizens. We need to actually remember what we said. We need to ask hard questions about the role of technology in public sector decision making. These are this is questions about, again, that have already been brought up, about data ownership, about privacy. We need to ask these questions about what role the public sector plays. And then again, instead of letting tech innovation lead, we need to articulate values with local communities that guide urban futures. And then finally, we need to incorporate meaningful inefficiencies into urban systems. It needs to be a design value that guides the way that we think about our near future cities. So with that, I thank you and look forward to the conversation.
And even more so, we thank you, Eric. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Contributions from you? Oh yeah,
Yes.
There's one up there.
Can I grab that? Is that water?
I'll just have to pass.
That I can use?
Hi, thank you. I was curious how, when you're talking about distributing ownership, and you're also talking about the sort of taking a hard look at the role of technology in city planning or urban networks, it sort of brought me back to this question of like the how critical private companies are in developing data analytics and data tools and data harvesting, et cetera, and that the state needs them, or the city needs them, and that they need the city to be this platform for the work that they do. But I can't help but thinking how how diametrically opposed these two entities are in terms of what their goal is, right? That a private company, certainly in the US at least, is working to maximize efficiency and to maximize profit and to retain ownership of what it produces. And it's sort of diametrically opposed to what you're saying a city should be doing. And I guess I was curious if maybe both you and Dr. Ziemer could both comment, because I think I really do understand that these are both critical elements in this discussion, but it's very hard for me to imagine what a real productive marriage between the public sector and the private company will look like moving forward.
Yeah, that's really loud. So I appreciate the question. I think it is one of the understanding what that dynamic is, what that relationship is a huge open question. And the challenge right now is that we are too far along the lines of technology decisions being made outside of the capacity of local communities or organizations to input into how that technology solution meets their problems. And so what I'm suggesting is that we need to make technology vendors more responsive to problems as opposed to having a solution that they're trying to sell to cities. And so Link NYC, I think, is a good example. I mean, yeah, the city's problem was they needed to do something with all the phone booths that they didn't need anymore. That was the first problem. But that doesn't necessarily address the how else those kiosks are solving any kind of urban problems. Now, what could happen is that the kiosks should be proposed as a technological solution, and then there should be some local input into the way in which that kiosk can be run. So that means perhaps the kind of data that it can collect, perhaps the kind of information that's available on those screens. Perhaps even with the collection of data, the kinds of uses that data can be put to. There was no local input into that. And so as we think about this, and there's no shortage of technology companies that are banging on the doors rather of municipalities saying, we want you to buy our stuff. And the problem is municipalities don't have the mechanism yet to figure out how to answer that banging. We don't have the mechanism yet to say, I see that you want to sell our stuff. Let's see if we need it. And that's not what's happening. What is happening is that there's a competition to become the most innovative. There's a competition to become the most smart so that we can attract jobs. But there's not a competition to be the most responsive, to actually to respond to the needs of the people who are already living in that city. So, and when I say distributing ownership, I don't mean literally I want Verizon to actually hand out shares to its company. What I do mean is that I want what I do mean is that people should have the ability to make use of that technology to best satisfy their needs. So that's what I mean by ownership, not literal ownership in the company. Yeah.
I have a little bit like a technical question for you, and that's related to some literature which I've recently seen on trust networks. So it's about trust, right? And what these people do is they model networks of agents, and what they model is they model the relations between these agents in terms of trust or distrust. Now, the relation between the agents is trustful if the link has a weight between 0 and 1, and it's distrustful if it has a weight between 0 and -1. So what they do is exactly, it's not the same as what you're doing, because you are assigning a maximal distrust with lacking trust somehow. And that's also what these people do, and they get completely different relations for the functioning of the network as a whole, depending on which situation they choose. Between assigning distrust to zero trust, or assigning maximal distrust to the negative of maximal trust. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so my question would be, does that make a difference for, if you're trying to identify lacking trust with somehow maximal distrust? Is that, do you have any comment to that? Does it make a difference for you?
Well, I think I think I'm understanding that. I guess I don't fully understand how the numbers work out. So how -1, how those values get assigned.
The weight for distrust would always be negative.
Yes.
The link weight, and the link weight for trust would always be positive.
And how is that determined?
That has to be assigned by some situation or whatever.
Okay.
But distrust is not zero trust.
Yes.
That's the point that I wanted to make.
Yes. So, I mean, one thing I will say is that as opposed to the work done in kind of network analysis and looking at trust from that perspective, what I'm really looking at is not peer-to-peer trust. One of there's the individual or group to institution level is what I'm interested in. And that often operates differently, because in the way that we trust our peers within networks, in social networks, sometimes that just means sort of recognition or presence within a network can build trust. So when someone likes my post over time, that can build trust. Whereas if a government continually likes my Facebook post, that actually makes me less trusting of that entity. So it just depends on who the actor is in this case. Yeah.
So in your case, it's a part-whole relationship as well.
Exactly.
Joachim is next. We have where's the other one here? Oh, there's one. Which one do you want first? Okay, you're first.
On the black box, the super smart MIT solution, which was perceived as a black box. And since I'm not working in this area, but more in the medical domain, it's the same complaint.
Yeah.
Now, the biggest black box is a human. And we are used to accept that because we basically give us a story, that's his or her experience. Nobody has any clue on a particular decision whether that experience is helpful. Statistically, if you train medical people, they have success.
Yeah.
Their stories quite often are not explaining their success. So what is the conclusion out of this? We love fake stories because it's simple in a situation where the whole world is too complex. So if you don't get a story, we say no.
So are you talking about distrust between patients and physicians? Is that?
Distrust between an automatic, algorithmically driven recommendation system, diagnosis, and therapy system, and the alternative to consult a doctor. And currently, since we are developing systems, as you do for the participation process or the planning process, we are developing that system as an interaction with humans. And
I see.
Is, it's not rational what we are doing.
I see. So how do we develop systems that... So, I mean, one of the challenges with what I know about the medical context is that access to information has created problems for physicians often because patients don't necessarily trust their input because they're already coming into that situation with a lot of information from the internet. And so one of the challenges is the authority of individuals is being challenged across the board, not just within the medical context, but the authority that I as a professor has is, I mean, my students challenge me all the time, darn it. But our authority as professionals is being challenged more and more. So in some ways, the solution is, well, let's create algorithmic systems that will bypass that now less trusted individual authority. Let's create algorithms that are perceived to be objective so that we no longer have to deal with that distrust of individuals, which also has its problems. You know, this is what I'm saying, is that the black box algorithm is perhaps even more problematic than the blind trusting of a single doctor, let's say. So how do we find systems where the algorithm can be checked by a human, where the intentions of that human are understood and disclosed, as opposed to thinking about them as binaries?
I think some of the problems is that we may not actually pursue exactly the goals we pretend to pursue. So quite often a human decision or recommendation might be preferable over an objectively better recommendation from an algorithm.
Yes.
Just because I like the human and I have no relationship to the algorithm. And so my meta goal was to actually establish a relationship and get a solution.
Yes.
And in that package.
Or can't we have humans that simply check the conclusions of the algorithm? You know, is there a place for a human that establishes that relationship, that establishes that connection, and makes sure that the algorithm has the best interest of that other human in mind?
Yeah, but you want to understand the algorithm.
Yes. I see what you're saying.
I mean,
yes.
The other point that you're raising is about bounded rationality, right? Because it's exactly the case. Exactly, and what we often try to do is we try to maximize the rationality aspect in an argument, and that's bound to fail if our conversation partner is bounded by a different degree of rationality. I mean, it's a well-known problem too.
Right, and this is a problem with a lot of decision support systems, is that they assume the rational decision maker. That you know, we have to design decision support systems to actually assume a deeply affective process that is clouded by all sorts of emotion and feeling. So that our algorithms are not yet good, nor perhaps should they be at doing that work.
Now the blue box finally.
The blue box, and could someone switch on the green box? I think it's not switched on anymore. The blue box.
Is it working? Is it working? Yeah. Yeah. I have a question on profit orientation. We have already established that obviously companies are profit oriented. They have to be to some degree if you don't want to risk disgruntled stakeholders. But this is my first question. What is your experience with cities and governments of any sorts that are profit-oriented? Because I attended a trade show half a year ago in Barcelona, and I had a very discouraging, or somebody came to my booth and he said something very discouraging. You know, it's all about profit optimization anyway, in the cities themselves. So they use, it was his version, they use the cloak of smart city and increase efficiencies to actually just save money. So I haven't had any specific experience on that, but maybe you and your research.
So can you restate the question though? There's a statement in there, but I didn't quite hear the question.
The man said it's all about profit orientation in cities as well. So they just want to save money by using smart city and build up efficiencies as an excuse.
I see. So yes, cities want to save money, and especially in the United States, we don't have a tax base to support what the cities actually need to do, and increasingly that's getting smaller. So cities are always in that position of needing to save money. The other motivation is that cities are competing for the sort of label of most innovative. You know, so for instance, I don't know if you followed the Amazon second headquarters competition, but we should see this in the same context. I mean, Amazon announced that they wanted to locate a second headquarters in a North American city. And then they had cities all over North America vying to be that second headquarters that was going to come with 50,000 high-paying jobs. So 50,000 high-paying jobs is going to move to a city. And then you had cities jumping through hoops, creating these, why the transportation system is the best, why the information ecosystem is the best. This is the place that can house this incredible capacity. So, and then they came down to a list of, I think there are 7 finalists now, and they still haven't decided. But what I'm trying to say is that in addition to cost savings, so much of what's happening now within smart cities is about the presentation of innovation. And because that's seen to attract jobs. So it is, at the end of the day, it is about money making. And so the challenge is now we have to think about what should the role of the public sector be, and how can we insert these kinds of values into public sector decision making. So yes, we know that there's going to be profit motivation. We know that there's going to be competition among cities. We know that there's going to be need to cut costs. But how do we then take that knowledge that that's of course a part of this, and then create a mechanism so that we can have other kinds of values guiding these decisions in addition to those. So that's really it. So I don't think I'm not suggesting that we bypass or somehow don't recognize that need for cost savings.
Yeah, that's my opinion too. It sounds way less, way better. It's about saving money, of course. The budgets are tight, but it's a mix of a lot of aspects. Just a second question. You talked about creating inefficiencies, and I always try to to create business use cases, at least understand in form of an example. So could you give me a practical example to build inefficiencies in a process? For example, San Diego, they put a lot of parking sensors in the parking lots, and they have an application in the cars that navigates you to an empty parking spot. For example, maybe you have a better one, but where do I create inefficiencies to improve the process?
So let me say that some infrastructure decisions don't require this. So, for instance, parking efficiencies, fantastic. Or I live in Boston. We have an incredible algorithm that determines where the snowplows go during a snowstorm, and it's great. I love it. That means there's snowplows are distributed appropriately across the city. There's no need for inefficiency in that. And the question is that we need to be smart about how we think about designing inefficiencies into systems that actually that require them, where there is a negotiation of values and needs that needs to be open to that kind of understanding and capacity. That doesn't apply to all things. So so again, like with the example of the new start times, maybe we assumed that start time decision didn't need any of these inefficiencies, but we were wrong, right? So the question is, we have to question our assumptions about whether or not the most efficient process is the best, and then we have to be ready to build into that process inefficiencies when they can be meaningful.
Yeah, so makes sense.
Yeah,
thank you.
Gesa, next question.
Thanks for the. Is it on?
Yeah,
I don't know what you understand. Thanks for the lecture. I would like to connect to the inefficiency discussion a little bit. If I understood that right, the Beta Block project was only an idea, or it's a suggestion. It's not applied. It's not realized, isn't it?
Not yet.
Not yet. But did you realize a project like this? So were you able to convince a government to use such processes that are different from their traditional way of communicating?
Yes. So I've done work all over the world with both digital and analog systems to create opportunities for dialogue and deliberation around particular issues. I've used web-based planning systems that prioritize dialogue over voting systems, for instance. So we built a platform called Community Planet that we've used in various places. where the idea of Community Planet was to create opportunities for dialogue online that we then moved to offline settings that we sort of inserted into policy planning decisions. Whether it was we've done processes around youth employment, we've done processes around urban planning in Detroit, for instance, using that. We've also designed, I've designed games. So for instance, I have a game called At Stake, which is it's a role-playing deliberation game that we've used in the participatory budgeting process in New York City. And At Stake is a game where people take on different roles in their community, and they compete to solve problems with small groups. There's a mobile device that are tethered with 5 people. And then they deliberate from different character perspectives in order to achieve solutions. What's interesting about that is that you're not only trying to get your idea across, but every person has a secret agenda, and even if your idea is chosen, if elements of my agenda are in your idea, then I get rewarded for that. So it's a game system that is designed to foster deliberation. So what we've done, most of my work has been designing tools that help facilitate these meaningful inefficiencies within a process. The reason I wanted to talk about beta blocks is because here we're talking about the implementation on a citywide scale beyond the individual tool. One of the critiques I have of my own research sometimes that I showed in the research that I was doing with other civic organizations is that it's very difficult for us to design tools and maintain relationships with communities after we do that research, right? After we design the tool and implement, it's very difficult to maintain those relationships. So the work that I'm doing now is about crafting systems that enable that kind of relationship building over time, and thinking about how we can design meaningful inefficiencies into processes as opposed to designing interventions that are meaningfully inefficient. I'm much more interested in the systems-wide level now.
And can I ask one more question? What about, you mentioned the Bristol project.
Yes.
I know this also a little bit. And my claim is also that we have to scale up projects sometimes. And the Bristol one is also very small, and it's a very site-specific thing.
Yes.
And when you mention your project now, it seems to be that some of them are also very site-specific. What do you think about this transferability, scaling up things? I mean, it's difficult sometimes.
So I'm less interested in scale than I am in reproducibility. So I don't think that all things scale. Because I believe in local context. But I do think that we need to design for things to be reproduced and reimagined within different local contexts. So, and so a lot of the work that I do is not really designed for scale. It's designed more in a kind of platform modality where you can take it, own it, reproduce it. So, so for instance, the Community Planet project I talked about was reproduced on local levels across different cities. And you know, all the games or tools or processes that we've designed have been used in that way. And I think the Bristol project, again, the impact of that project, yes, it did happen on a very local level. It also has inspirational capital. It has inspired other cities to do different things, and we can't underestimate that. And it's been reproduced in other neighborhoods throughout Bristol. So it has been reproduced. But I agree with you that we need to start thinking bigger. But I want us not only to think about scale and other ways of thinking bigger. A blue question.
My name is Lynn Tabakovic. I work in community development for the city of Zurich. And my question was a similar one, like Ms. Ziemer already asked. And, okay, thank you. You mentioned that now you're looking for solutions to maintain the relations after the intervention, and my question is, do you already have some results you could share? Did you find anything?
So, see, what happens when that gets louder is that I get louder too. That's I understand how difficult your job is back there, sound guy. Yeah. So, I think that's so data to share about the longitudinal relations not necessarily, and let me say a little bit more about that. I also have become more aware of the appropriate role of a university lab, and so in a context of university lab, I can't maintain relationships over time with every community that I work with. However, I feel like it has to be our role to foster the conditions where people can maintain that work over time themselves. So that's the importance of distributing ownership, capacity building. All of that happens within the university context, where university researchers tend to be terrible at that. And so in my own work, my work is often funded by outside foundations or funders, and that funding has funding cycles, and then it ends, and then it's really difficult for me to, in any kind of significant way, continue to collect data over time to think about those relationships. And nobody wants to fund kind of long-term research on this area. So I don't have a good answer for you in terms of I have data that shows that after 5 years there's this impact when you do this work in this way. But it is my goal to be able to do that work, and this is what I was saying before: is that so much of my work has been kind of year-long cycles here and there, and so the goal is to have longer-term ability to collect this data over time, so that we can actually make claims about what happens when you do this work that's values forward, and that prioritizes relationship and meaning making. So the data that I can point you to is short-term impact. So the studies that I've done have looked at has looked at the way in which this kind of lateral trust gets formed. So meaning that people trust more in their community after engaging in these kinds of dialogues or playful interventions than they do if they were just being talked at in an environment like this one. You don't trust me. I just talked at you for a long time, but you have no reason to trust me. Now, if we were to organize this differently, that we have good evidence to say that, and this had like significant bearing on your life, that we have good evidence to suggest that you would have longer-term trust, not only in the institutional authority, but also among peers to be able to get things done. So in my research, I've looked at collective efficacy, for instance, as an important measure, which is essentially the idea that people collectively feel empowered to get things done. And so using that measure alone, we were able to point to some interesting and significant findings. When you do a process like the one that I've described, that you have an increase in collective efficacy of that group, that they feel more empowered to get things done. The data that I don't have is whether or not they did get things done, right? So I don't have that data, unfortunately. But I know that the kind of work that I'm talking about can be impactful, and this is why I'm super interested now in thinking about this on more of a systems-wide level, because I think we need to do this kind of work on that level.
I have 2 more questions. The first one is down here, and the second one up there.
Hello. My name is Anja Baum. I work with the city of Warsaw. Is this on? Yes? Okay, great. Two small questions. First, the idea that meaningful inefficiencies as design in game systems is very interesting. This brought to mind the idea of gamification, which is mainly kind of managing behavior change and managing kind of expected behavior outcomes, which immediately also, I'm sure, reminded us all of London's nudging experiment, which actually failed for ethical reasons. So my first question is, in this gamification in the public kind of stakeholder sphere, where do you see this ethical line? Or is this of concern? So that's my first question. The second one is the idea. So it's a completely second question, different approach here. In designing meaningful inefficiencies into the process, I see, if I understand, that one of these examples that you have mentioned was the RFP processes, which are designed in Boston. Wait for the bell.
Yeah.
The RFP processes, which are designed in Boston to adhere to this community charter, right, as a meaningful inefficiency in the sense that you have to, these Verizons and AT&Ts are forced to consider the needs of the populations, right, of the different neighborhoods. So we experimented a little bit in gamification elements in the city of Warsaw's RFP processes. Most recently for a bit of a gamification element in RFP for a CRM database, basically, system for the educational systems, school systems. It was very simple. It was such as, in-game rewards for correctly inputting data. This created a big problem, both on the sides of, once this came out, the RFP publicly, actually, what do you mean, what kind of in-game rewards, right, on the side of, let's say, one stakeholders, but also for our industry partners who absolutely did not understand what are we trying to do, and we found this to be basically the RFP, nobody answered to it, and we had a lot of legal issues, actually, around this. So the question, my second one would be, what are the ways you would recommend or you would think of from your research? It would be interesting if hard coding this meaningful inefficiencies into the process of urban tech and civic tech.
Yeah. So let me start with the first question on gamification. I specifically didn't use that. I don't like the word gamification because I think gamification is this. It's and as you already mentioned, it's kind of a nudge. Gamification is creating an incentive system to get you to the already known goal as fast as you can, right? That's not what a meaningful inefficiency is. And so the idea is that most gamified systems are, we're going to reward users or players to do the thing that we already know we want them to do. And so a game system, that doesn't, in a game, we can think about the experience of playing the game. Yes, we know what our goal is in the game, but it's the process of getting there and having the opportunity to play that makes that meaningful. And that's why I think there's a big difference between gamification and games. That's one thing. And so, because I think gamification and the whole concept of behavioral economics and nudging tends to bypass the idea of play or meaning making. That's not, those kinds of inefficiencies aren't assumed in the process. Now, to your second question, how do you hard code this, into an RFP? I think that's an interesting challenge. I actually would point you to the recent Boston RFP for the Beta Blocks project. I think they did a good job, and I can share that with you if you're interested, or it's on their website. But one of the things that they did was they structured in that. They structured in the requirements of the RFP that the process of public input is not just one element, but actually guides the entire process. So this is another interesting. So the other thing I would point you to is the struggles that the National Science Foundation is having in the United States. They've put a huge amount of money into the Smart and Connected Cities program. And they had in the Smart and Connected Cities program, there is a nod to public input, and the kinds of work that they're funding is really just, basic research with a meeting, and they haven't been able to actually create these kinds of systemic changes in the way that work gets done or in the way that knowledge is produced or shared. And so so they are now working, beginning to work with the Knight Foundation, which is a private foundation that is helping to shape the way in which the National Science Foundation actually thinks about public process. And so that's an interesting move that I'm very excited about, where we might actually begin to see, in the United States, we might actually begin to see the funding of this kind of work that prioritizes these meaningful inefficiencies. But I think on a simple level, it's really about making system-wide contributions of public input as opposed to a single element in a larger process.
Do you work with the Boston mayor's new urban mechanics?
I've worked with them for many years, yeah. Interesting organization, yeah.
Now the last question before the break is up there.
My question has actually been answered by the last two persons stating their questions, so thank you too.
Great. That was the easiest question ever.
That saves us a little bit of time. Thank you very much. So let's thank Eric once more.
Thank you.